On September 17th, 2011, about 1,000 people gathered in Zuccotti Park in Wall Street in New York. Zuccotti Park was the first Occupy protest that got widespread attention. By October 9th, 3 weeks later, more than 951 protests in 82 countries, including more than 600 protests in the United States, had occurred. 3 weeks. Occupy has been called a contagious and leaderless movement, aimed at inserting topics into the national conversation or the global conversation, and it differs from previous social protests in that it was not centrally orchestrated and it didn't make specific demands. I spent some time walking through Pioneer Park in 2011 with the Occupy protesters in my first semester of PhD school, trying not to look like the running dog capitalist that I sometimes am, and researching their perspectives and trying to understand. And one of the things that was really obvious from the ground, and that scholars have said about the Occupy movement, is that there were not a specific set of demands. It was about wage equality at a macro level and about inequality in society at a macro level, but it wasn't, we want to be allowed to sit on the front seat of the bus. It wasn't as specific as previous protests. And it formed seemingly spontaneously, spread quickly, and ended within a few months. So most of us as business people are familiar with the Occupy movement and the protests that it spawned through 2012. And we most likely all have opinions about the ideology of the movement. So I didn't bring up Occupy to engage in any of those ideological debates. I brought up Occupy to start a conversation about organizing, how people work together, when and why they work together, and what organizational forms they create and join in order to enable that shared work. And more importantly, how organizing is changing in recent years, because I think that's something we as business people need to pay attention to. Many organizational scholars, myself included, consider Occupy to be an early example of network-based organizing, where loosely affiliated individuals come together and there's not a principal authority. The Arab Spring protests the year before was similar to that, but it started in Tunisia and spread, worldwide in many ways. But Occupy kind of took it to the next level. The Tea Party movement is another example of a supposedly leaderless organization. I thought Dwayne had an interesting experience with the Tea Party movement. Tell us about your Tea Party experience.
Okay, so I had a lapse of judgment and decided to run for state senator. I had some people that encouraged me because they didn't like the current state senator. Anyway, so it was in the Republican Party and they had the caucuses. And a lot of the caucus members were Tea Party members. And so one of them was the self-proclaimed leader of the Tea Party movement in Utah. And he said, well, are you a Tea Party member? And I said, how do you join? Right? I said, I didn't know there was actually an official organization. And he said, well, it's too late now. Right? I said, like some of the principles I agree with, but I don't even know how, is this an organization? And so it was unclear to me. So it was never really a formal organization, but it became national in scope.
He doesn't know if he's joined.
But I don't know who was in charge of it on a nationwide level. Mike Lee somehow was considered a Tea Party candidate.
Self-proclaimed.
Anyway, I just thought it was really fascinating.
So why do we as business people care how a social movement is organized? Especially a social movement known to be ideologically at odds with many of the values held by the business community and by people who run companies. I would argue it's because a discussion of organizing is a discussion of the relationship between individual and institution. And like it or not, corporations are institutions in society. So if people are protesting institutions, if people are interacting with institutions differently than they used to, if they are joining institutions or doing other things with institutions differently than they used to, it affects our ability to create and sustain organizations in our own companies where people can and want to work together. And this talk just highlights some recent trends in organizing and explores what those trends might mean for business people. Specifically, I'll argue that some fundamental shifts are occurring between the individual and the institution in American society. So this is enabled by greater flows of information, because flow always changes organizing, and easier methods of connecting independent of geography. So a lot of people have asked me, did social media cause the things you're talking about? Well, in trend spotting, we don't talk about cause and effect. I do not know what has caused these things, and neither do you, really, as we get talking about them. There's no absolutes. We're not saying everybody thinks this way. This activity led to this thing. The things I'm going to describe for you happen everywhere in every group. That's not how trend spotting works. So I'm not here making a universal case, and I'll just make that disclaimer up front. I am here helping us identify some trends and giving you some practical examples of how my company has worked with some of these trends and what they might mean for business. So individuals are disaffiliating with formal organizations, churches, schools, governments, corporations, political parties, in record numbers. They're protesting against institutional control, and they're self-organizing rather than accepting organizations created for them. And they're looking for organizations they can find satisfaction in, rather than assuming that satisfaction will be found in the traditional groups that their family or their religious upbringing or their location suggests will satisfy them. So more people now lead organizations rather than just join them. Organization is undertaken more frequently. Essentially, organization itself has become a bottom-up tool of the populace rather than a top-down mechanism used by people in charge, as we might be used to. As business people, we create departments, we create companies, we structure how people work together, we form organizations. So how can company leaders, interact in this new egalitarian world of individual empowerment that is sometimes called anti-institutional? How do we hire people and get them to work toward a common goal when their experiences in the broader society have taught them that top-down organizations suppress their individuality? How about when they're accustomed to creating an organizational structure for themselves rather than just accepting a structure created by someone else? There is a new desire for individual freedom that is dismantling the workplace as we know it, disrupting the workplace as we know it. If business leaders don't figure out how we can change our policies and our practices so as to maximize personal liberty and minimize group control while also getting the work done, our employees may abandon us in droves. The Wayfair petition we were talking about yesterday, 500 employees petitioning about what Wayfair is doing, who they're selling to. It would be a loss if we didn't figure this out, because organizational research suggests that individuals today still want connection. They still want to, in fact, they're craving that connection more than ever before, and they still want to work with others. They want a place to belong. They want their work to make a difference. They want to matter. So in short, they want the same thing businesses want, same thing business people want. But the challenge for people managers is to capitalize on employees' desires to contribute to the group while simultaneously respecting their need for individual freedom, and to do it in a way that is actually practical and financially viable, which is the piece that is often missing from the conversation. When my organizational communication scholar friends talk about these topics, they talk about overthrowing business and overthrowing societal institutions and allowing people to be free. But they don't actually talk about all the benefits that come from the institutions in society nearly as often, and what we as business people create with our employees in terms of opportunity and economic improvement. And so One of the things I study and I'm trying to bring into the discussion is that those two worlds do need to come together, because we live in a practical world where we have to figure out how to make this work. So we're going to talk about 4 things today. We're going to talk about 3 new paradigms about organizing. So we're going to go through what is happening with organizing and practices that we're seeing in society with organizing. And then that'll lead us to 3 ways people are now thinking about organizations and institutions. And then from that, we'll talk about what people want and don't want in their organizations. All people, all the time, in every organization. Okay, you know that it's not a universal. That's the last time I'll say that. And then we're going to talk about 6 principles for workplace freedom. Kind of a principle-oriented approach, because I can show you some practical examples, and I will give you some practical examples. I have some handouts, and I can make those available to you digitally if you prefer. I feel like you should have the freedom, since I'm speaking about freedom, to absorb these materials any way you want. And you can look at them in here and throw them away on your way out the door and then ask for a digital copy. I'm good with that, whatever works for you. But we can talk about these practices all day, and you'll have ideas for practices in your own company. The principles, I think, are what we can take away from the trend. The practices will be customized. Then we're just going to kind of summarize the old way and the new way. The old way where institutions were viewed differently than the new way where institutions are now viewed in light of some of these recent practices in organizing. All right, any comments or questions up to that point? We'll have a little more open discussion, but that's kind of the framing of what we're doing. Okay?
Everybody excited?
Could you just dance or something? No, I understand. All right, so new paradigms about organizing. Let's talk about what is happening with organizing. What are we seeing? One of the things we're seeing is multiple memberships. Multiple memberships. So those of you in the room who are over 40, I want you to think back to your 20s. I want you to think about how many groups you were part of in your 20s. I was part of a school alumni group. I was part of a workplace group and a department within that workplace. I was a runner, so I had a local running group that I participated in. I was part of a church group there in my community. I have racked my brain and cannot come up with other groups that I would consider myself part of.
Book club.
Book club, okay. A book club group. You'd meet periodically to review books. Other groups that you may have been part of?
Did you have a sub-social group?
I had no social life. I worked.
Okay.
Oh, wait.
Well,
That's all of you.
I found it interesting talking with my kids and whatnot. I loved the little town I was from. I loved the high school I went to. I loved that I was from Utah and that I was from the United States and proud citizen of planet Earth. You know, whatever it is, I felt that sense of a group as well. And my kids could care less about their high school and could care less about.
Interesting.
And they're embarrassed that they're from Utah.
Yeah, it's interesting. Our groups were really location dependent, right? My community, my neighborhood, these people next door, the school that we all go to, the city that we all live in, this state and country that we all live in. Yeah, interesting point. The memberships that we used to be part of were usually countable on 1 or 2 hands, right? That is not true anymore with organizing. And it's not just virtual groups, and scholars really have made a pretty compelling argument that a virtual group has many of the same aspects of a physical group in terms of an organization. So virtual does matter. But the notion of membership has changed. I'm part of a whole bunch of things. You know, this is a smattering of the 100+ Facebook groups I'm part of. Now, I'm a researcher, academic researcher, and a business person, and I have affiliations all across the map. You would have a hard time identifying my identity from my list of groups because I'm a researcher, so I do that on purpose. But I'm not unusual in having 100 or more groups that I hear something from somebody in those groups and connect in some way with those groups, and in some cases follow on with physical activity. You know, I meet those people. You know, even a garage sale group, you meet those people, right? You think about it. that connection between online and offline is actually far more real than you might have thought of it, right? But multiple memberships. I am in multiple groups. What are the implications for the workplace of multiple memberships? Any thoughts?
Spread yourself too thin.
Spread yourself too thin, meaning your employees might be spread too thin, or you might be spread too thin. Yeah, there's a concept in scholarship called greedy organization, which is this organization, the more greedy an organization is, the more of your time and energy and emotion it takes, right? The workplace could be more greedy when there wasn't 100 memberships, right? That's a good point. Any other thoughts on the effect of multiple memberships?
Well, it puts employees, expands their network, so they have more opportunities for different places of employment. There's
Yeah.
more people they know, and it's more likely they will leave your.
Or is it? It's more likely they'll talk to people
Yeah.
outside of you. People used to get their information from those 5 memberships. You know, that was really how you saw the world, and you would turn on the news too. But they are talking to a lot of people that are not you now. And that's different than we're used to. We're going to talk about whether that's good or bad and whether it causes them to leave or not. But it's a good point.
You can put labels on yourself as well.
Say it again.
You label yourself. Like if you're
I
a
am
member
this,
of,
I am that.
I'm this, I'm that. Or, so, you know,
Yeah.
if you're a member of the NRA or you're a member of a church organization, other people will immediately draw
Yeah.
conclusions from whatever groups you show that you belong to.
And we know that in the workplace differently than we used to, right? My employees know my membership groups because several of them have friended me on LinkedIn or friended me on Facebook. And these are not things I talk about at work, but now I'm talking about them at work. So that's an interesting point, right? Groups with conflicting ideals or purposes. This is very common in recent years, partly because geography is not a requirement to join groups anymore, and partly because multiple memberships, is my theory, multiple memberships means I'm exposed to a variety of ideas, and so I'm way more comfortable with hearing a variety of ideas than I used to be, right? I literally follow the Utah Republican Party and the Utah County Democratic Party on LinkedIn. Why? Am I Republican or Democrat? Well, you won't know from looking at what I'm following. But I find value in that because I find it shows me the party's perspectives, and I find that interesting. I am not alone in that. That is what scholars are seeing that people are doing. They're joining, a protest group against a policy of their church, and they're joining a devotional group about their church. And they're in both, and occasionally it comes up in real life, and they have to defend why they're in both, right? That is not something that could easily happen in the past, meaning that that you had to get in your car and physically travel in front of the neighbors to the meeting that was happening down the street that night and declare your allegiance in ways that you don't always have to do with what's been enabled in the virtual world. So what's the implication for the workplace of that?
So I'm curious, since you brought up politics, so I wrote down a note that is this self-organizing versus the traditional organizing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is this what we see with what's happening in the Democrat Party today, where essentially the far left, if you call it that, is self-organizing against, or at least maybe not even against, just it's happening naturally or coincidentally or whatever the reason is, against the traditional organization of the Democrat Party? Is that the two?
Yeah, that's a perfect example of self-organizing, right? Self-organizing is I can get other people together to do a particular thing. And if you think about your grandfather or your father, that probably wasn't how he viewed the world, that he could just get people together to do. I mean, there were unions. People have been protesting institutions from the beginning of time in a variety of ways, banding together. I'm not saying this is new. I'm saying the convergence of these trends is...
And I think it's caught the party totally off guard because they haven't thought about it. I guess that's what
Yeah,
it makes us is-
most institutions have been totally caught off guard by this. Don't be ourselves. Yeah, I think you're right. The Republican Party is having the same problem, actually. All right, decentralized organizing. So we gave these examples already of decentralized organizing and what that's all about. decentralized organizing is interesting because it tells me that power comes from the number of peers I gather and not from any single institutional authority. Think about that for a minute. Apparently, it's a centralized slide. All right, blurred boundaries between groups. So have you ever participated on Facebook, for example, and had one of your friends make a comment on something and then had a completely different person from a different social network in your life make a comment to that friend? The first time this happened to me, and one of my academic friends and one of my church friends engaged in a conversation about a topic on my Facebook thread, it messed with me. I was like, you people do not know each other. More importantly, I act a certain way when I'm talking academic and a certain way when I'm talking church, and I don't think they're ideologically in conflict, but I rhetorically don't have to manage my messages with both of you in the room. Right? It's different when your groups blend. It's different when your groups blend. You know, what happens when the hearty dialogue about the environment that my employees are engaged in outside of their work group intersects with something I might say about what we should or shouldn't do related to the environment in our company. Those groups just intersected, right, in really interesting ways. So there is a group called Healthy Sexuality or something like that for Mormon women. I am in this group. Too much information, perhaps? Go with me on this. So I'm in this group. I'm mostly a lurker in this group, but I am in this group. And the other day, unexpectedly, my 19-year-old married daughter posted in this group about how often she and her husband do the deed. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, how did you get in this group? This is way too much blurring of my group boundaries. I do not want to have this conversation with you in public. I do not want to know this information about you. I have no problem talking about sex, but it was totally contextually wrong. And I did not know how to respond, so I didn't respond. I sort of opted out, and I didn't opt out of the group, but I just withdrew from that conversation. Blurring of boundaries. It's really kind of an interesting organizational phenomenon. Blurring of boundaries. More chances to lead. I mean, if I have 100 different things I'm part of versus 4 or 5, I have more opportunities to play different roles in those groups. I have more opportunities to lead or to follow. I have a niece who is an accomplished event planner. She's 26 years old, I think, and she has run major events. She's in demand. Everyone who hires her to run these events is thrilled with her. She's been doing events since she was 16. And she's in her last semester of college, and every time she runs an event for the college, they treat her like a little girl, you know, who maybe could get them a drink. And this is a machine, and this is how we set it up for the event. And it drives her crazy that she can lead in one place and is expected to be a follower in another place. In her mind, if she's a leader, she could be a leader everywhere because it's about who she is. And she doesn't know why these people won't recognize that. Right? Our identity is taking a different our identity is becoming more important than our role, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. So your workplace has to give more chances to lead, you know, spoiler. Hello. All right, another thing that's happening, temporary groups. Groups are forming and dissolving, and that didn't used to happen. A group was so hard to start. You know, you had to walk around and get everyone to sign the petition. You had to, when you think about reorganization at your company, you probably have this perception that organization is complex, that you don't do it accidentally, that there's messaging surrounding it, that it's difficult to reorganize in some ways, right? You don't just do it. You're like, I need stability for these people. Let's don't reorganize every 5 minutes. The broader society is reorganizing constantly. So we, in an institutional setting, are kind of at odds with that broader society that's reorganizing constantly. You know, I threw up a Slack channel at work to bring a group together for an initiative we were working on and a meeting we were holding, and I'll cancel the Slack channel next week. It's an organization. You don't necessarily think of it as an organization, but it's a group of people getting together, working together in a certain way for a certain topic. it's a fluid organization. It's a transitory organization. It's not just a temporary. It's not just a normal and accidental part of our daily interaction. It's actually an organizational form, and that's what scholars are finding, is that the fact that an organization can dissolve at a moment's notice changes my perception of how stability matters to me. Right? Why are people leaving jobs so frequently? I don't know, but it might be that organizations dissolve a lot and new ones start. There's a group called Pantsuit Nation on Facebook that formed in the middle of the Clinton-Trump election, a time period we would all probably be happy to forget because of the trauma in society that surrounded it in dialogue. Pantsuit Nation formed for this election. And then another group formed called Beyond Pantsuit Nation, because they didn't think Pantsuit Nation was properly addressing race issues in this. And then another group formed as a protest to Beyond Pantsuit Nation. And then that group, the second group disappeared, and then the first group disappeared, and then the third group disappeared, and then the first group has now, become a powerhouse and kind of changed its direction on what it's temporary organizing. Okay? This, I think, is one of the more significant organizing practices we're seeing. Affiliation is fluid. Not just organizations are coming and going, but people are coming and going. They are feeling free to enter and exit with less stigma, with less shame, with less pressure, with less guilt than they used to from organizations. Give you a couple of examples of this. That, are people having trouble with long-term connections? I mean, one argument is that they are, and that workers are changing jobs in the U.S. every 4.4 years. Now, I've actually seen every 3 years from a couple of other sources, and I think anecdotally we can see that in our own lives, the lives of our children and our employees, changing jobs is a thing. Is changing jobs a thing because organizations are dissolving, or is changing jobs a thing because people feel free to enter and exit? Probably both. We don't know. Well, go ahead.
So are you suggesting that in the future, so I just think traditionally, you're right, we set up organizations, sales, engineering, marketing, whatever, right? And so people are in those groups, and the company is an organization.
Yep.
And then you get sort of pulled out onto a project team sometimes, but you're still originally affiliated with that, your traditional job, let's call it. Are you suggesting that maybe we need to think about being more fluid in the sense of the organization and to be not labeled as, let's say, an engineer, but I'm working in this project or this group in this period of time, and then I can freely move over and be a sales guy, and then, based on the company needs, which is kind of exciting to think about, that people would be open to that kind of fluidity versus traditionally, like I thought I was going to be an engineer and work in the same company for 30 years. That clearly hasn't happened. Exciting
and quite a bit different, and it's hard to see a path from here to there, right? Like what we're going to talk about today are some practical things too. The rise of the project-based organizing, where it crosses a formal organizational line in an institution and people from different departments get pulled into a project, that is consistent with the trends you're seeing here. Project-based organizing is one way that institutions have responded to this this changing desire for freedom and flexibility. People want a series of experiences. They don't just want one.
Right. So why people may be
siloed
leaving is
function.
they want to try a new thing. Whereas they could have probably tried it in the current organization had the organization been open to allowing that fluidity without sort of being stuck in your organizational structure, I guess.
Excuse
I've
me.
even tried that in my marriage. I started as the boss, and now I'm the janitor.
You have seen that fluidity. Well, and marriage is a perfect example of an organization that most of us don't think we should exit. We're committed to our marriages. We feel like they're very important. But what happens when they no longer meet our needs? We try to do something about the organization, right? That's kind of what I'm proposing for business organizations. Let's adjust and change how we're approaching group control and what we're allowing or enabling, or at least not getting in the way of people trying to do, because it really doesn't make practical sense to throw out business and to throw out departments and to throw out organization. I don't believe that society will exist very effectively without institutions. Others do believe that, so it's okay if you don't. But I mean, if you believe that. College students drop out and
sounds
transfer.
like a yes. What you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah. The answer is, if you look at these trends and you think it would work for you, then yes. Right?
I don't know if it would work for me. It's kind of exciting, but also scary.
Doesn't that just describe a trend right there? So divorces, breakups are high. College students are transferring a lot. These are just some institutional, some studies about formal institutions that have been seeing entry and exit different than they expected. Okay. So the rise of the nuns. Has anyone ever seen this book before? It's actually a really fascinating book. The Pew Center for Research, which is a well-known research group, did a study in 2012 of 35,000 Americans, and they asked about their religious affiliation. And they discovered, for the first time ever, that none, I have no religious affiliation, I'm unaffiliated with any formal religion, was the fastest growing category. Faster growing than all other religions in the United States. This was very significant for religious scholars because they had been clamoring already to figure out why church membership seemed to be declining, and why the ways that the churches have always done things wasn't necessarily appealing anymore. And so this study came out right at that time, and the rise of the nuns has become a pretty significant thing to people who are studying formal organization. The independents are now the biggest partisan group in the United States. So a plurality of all registered voters nationwide identify as independents. I'm going to pick on you for a second. Tell us your VFW story.
Heather and I were talking about this, but I'm a veteran, and usually, all my peers, most of my peers from my community are unaffiliated with the VFW or any veteran organization and do not publicly identify as veterans. And you go back to my grandfather, who was a World War II veteran, and he was very much pro-VFW, pro-Elks Club, pro these groups, and it's absolutely the complete opposite direction of my peers.
Why?
Just don't see any value in it.
He said, we don't join those things. When I asked him this question, he said, we're just forming our own groups that deliver what we need. Was anecdotally very supportive of this book.
Isn't it likely that the nuns will become sons?
The independent becomes its own affiliation.
The book is already identifying them as a group.
Right.
Whereas before they didn't want to be in a group.
Right.
So now, independents want to be independent, but now independents become...
It plays to my belief and scholars' research that people want to be connected.
Yeah, they want
that
to.
we are going to continue to connect together to do things. It's just that the way in which we talk about it is changing, and the way in which the compromises of our individual identity that are required to do things with other people, the line might be in a little different place than it used to be. Yeah.
Isn't that also a response because some people doesn't know really what they want? So independent is also that gives them the freedom to choose something different maybe in 2 months or 3 months. It's maybe lack of direction could be also that.
Yeah.
I mean, just not necessarily that they have a focus or that they are against the, how would I say it, a party or a group itself. It's just they don't know what they are.
Yeah, or they don't want to be fixed in that place. My research has demonstrated that people want the option to develop their identity however they want, and they feel like aligning with organizations fixes their identity in a certain way. And if their identity changes, then how do they manage that? And so they're, in many cases, choosing to unaffiliate formally, even if they agree with the things the organization does. Now, organizing now takes place in public. Have you noticed? Have you noticed that what you do takes place in public? Have you noticed that salaries really are public at your company, even if you don't make them public? Have you noticed that whatever back channel thing you were planning to do with reorganizing a particular department doesn't seem like much of a surprise when you actually do it? Have you noticed that your internal company business is posted in reviews sometimes by customers? Organizing takes place in public. Now, I know we all know that, meaning that we all realize that we have to pay a little more attention to what the rest of the world thinks of us as business people than we used to, and get a good PR firm and manage it differently. But think about it at a fundamental level. If it's the act of people working together is now done in public, that means that all the things that go into how people work together, which is my reluctance to work with you, my excitement to work with you, my frustration about what you just said to me, my desire that I'm in charge instead of you, all of the stuff that goes into organizing that we are used to managing in an individual way with individual people in a respectful and humane and helpful way, right? Like we do our organizing benevolently in business. All of that is now public. There's really nothing that isn't public in organizing. And if you accept that premise, it means you have to focus on not just sounding like you're not doing the wrong thing, but not actually doing the wrong thing, because they're running out whatever you do. It's all public. It's all public. So the only exclusivity anymore in organizing is to protect. And this is kind of an interesting thing that's happening with organizing. There is this societal norm that organizations are supposed to be open, right? That inclusivity is a thing. Everyone should be allowed to join. I should be part of this, and I should be part of that, and you can't keep me out. And, Rotary Club needs to change its gender demographics, and, the organizations need to change and allow everybody in. But yet there are still organizations that are very difficult to join. And they claim that they need to be difficult to join because the system and the people in charge have historically not given them a voice at the table in organizing, and so they've formed their own organization to get a voice at the table. And an example is the Pantsuit Nation group I talked about earlier. Pantsuit Nation is a private Facebook group. You cannot find it on a search engine. I mean, the black crowd can find it on a search engine, the black hat internet people, but you can't find it on a search engine. You have to be invited to join by someone who is a member, right? It grew to almost 2.5 million members in, what did I say yesterday, like 2 months? I mean, it grew unbelievably fast. But it's the reason it exists. Its stated purpose was to provide a safe space for people who supported Hillary Clinton to be able to talk about her policies and their views and the societal issues that they think went with it without being shut down or corrected. Right? So it was on purpose designed to be an exclusive space that protected people, kept them from being able to derail the people who felt like they didn't have a voice. It's interesting. I tried to join, I did some research with people who were Mormons or LDS as young women, but they did not need to be LDS as adults. They could be affiliated with anyone or not affiliated with any religious group. And I wanted to be sure I had a wide variety represented in my research, and so I attempted to post my research call everywhere. I attempted to post it in groups that had affiliation with active Mormons, groups that had affiliation with disaffected Mormons or former Mormons or Utahns or women or, anyone associated with the local schools in the area, just a wide variety of people that might in some way connect to this. And I could not at first get access to the largest ex-Mormon group because access is quite restricted. And I actually had to have a meeting with the moderator of that group and assure him that I was not going to cause harm, that I was there for research, that I was not going to shut anybody down. I had to show him my research. I had to assure him that I had affiliation with both University of Utah and BYU, and therefore I was neutral. I had to demonstrate. And then he said, you can go post your call, but you need to use my name, otherwise they will shut you down. You need to say that I gave you permission to do this. So that's kind of weird in a world where everything's public. Everything's public except the things you can't join because you're in the power position. Think about that. Think about that.
This is the freedom of speech conflict we're having today in society.
Say it again.
This is the freedom, to me, there's this conflict of freedom of speech, right? So we have it constitutionally, but yet when we exercise it, we have a massive potential people that come against it to try to shut it down.
Well, and I think you can see that with
So
any kind of
digitally
freedom.
it's happening.
Yeah, I think you can see that with any kind of freedom. The actual application of freedom is way more complex than the rhetoric about freedom, right? You know, you want to give your kids freedom, and so you spell out for them what you're going to pay for them and what they're going to pay for themselves in an effort to make them more self-reliant and therefore more free. Or is he controlling his kids by telling them that they're going to pay this? And is it okay to control? It's the application of freedom is always more complicated, and it's way more complicated when done in public. By the way, way more complicated. The private sphere is public. So what this means is things that used to be private, like my daughter's personal sex life, things that used to be private are public sphere. Public sphere in communication scholarship has typically been identified as the sphere where people come together to make policy, to debate issues that affect all of us, right? And the argument was, your bedroom habits do not affect all of us, so they don't belong in the public sphere, right? Well, part of the resistance to institutions has been this, what I have to say is as valid as what you have to say. And if my experience is in the home, then I should be able to bring arguments about the home into the public sphere. It's actually an ideological resistance to talk freely about private things, typically private things in a public setting. It's not just because Facebook has made it available to everybody, but it's because it's a form of institutional resistance to bring things into the discussion that if you felt they were silenced before, right? So that's part of why private sphere and public sphere are blurring. And you're not just in front of your employees in a public setting, you're in front of their spouses and their children and maybe their parents, right? Frequent reorganizing. Groups are just shifting purposes way more often in broader society than used to happen in business. Organizing can give the average person resources. So we are good at monetizing organization. That's what our businesses are. That's our entire business is about monetizing organization. How people work together, turning that into something that actually makes money, right? We've had a pretty good corner on that in business. We are the ones who knew how to monetize. Other people could get together and maybe affect societal change, but we're the ones who knew how to monetize. Other people are having success monetizing outside of business. I mean, Kickstarter is just an example. A lot of the other crowdsourced fundraising, there's actually legitimate resources, money and goods, that can change hands because of self-organizing now. Other people are figuring out how to monetize. You're not the only option for economic prosperity and viability anymore. Do you ever think of Kickstarter as an organizational trend and a delivery of money and resources? I didn't until I started studying this. And finally, people join for purpose. Not because of the sponsor lives near them, geography, a particular institution is running something, or authority. Now, this is not always true. A lot of times, in the last time we talked about this, someone brought up that people joined for peers. That is true. People still join for other reasons. They join for peers. They join, because mom said to. They join for a lot of reasons. But it is common in society now for a statement of purpose to be in front of me before I decide to join. Like if you just look at the public school versus charter school world and the charter school movement in Utah specifically, before we had a whole bunch of charter schools, you went to the local elementary school because you lived there and it was there. And you might at some point, if you had problems with the teacher administration, you might pull up the mission and read it and kind of see, like, why are you having such trouble? But really you didn't care because that was the institution you were supposed to be part of. But if you want to send your kid to a charter school, you will most likely pull up the charter for the charter school. Pull up the mission. You'll say, what is the school all about? What will my child's experience at this school be? You will choose the school based on the charter, not based on the location. Now the location will be a factor if there's 3 charter schools and one of them's 20 minutes away and 2 of them are 5 minutes away. Unless these charters are terrible in terms of your alignment, you'll probably go there. But you are joining with a more mission-driven sense than you were. Well, companies know this. We've been coming up with mission statements and core values, and we've been kind of trying to respond to this in that it seems like our employees want to know the big picture purpose more than maybe they did in the past. So I'm not saying we're missing this trend. I'm saying the significance of these is how they all come together at the same time. A freedom to enter and exit is a lot different when I have 100 groups I'm a member of, right? Because I know more about what's going on, and these modify each other. So paradigm. Organizations exist to serve me. I don't exist to serve them. Before you just attribute this to selfishness, take a minute and think it through. Organizations exist to serve me. How many times have you, even in a CEO position, recently said, this particular thing I'm part of is not working for me. Vistage is not set up the way I want. That Dwayne needs to change his model. Hypothetically, because Dwayne's awesome, so we know that's hypothetical. But this running group doesn't meet at the right time. We do not even, as power people, we are used to changing things that don't work for us, but your kids do the same thing. Your employees do the same thing. I would argue it's not necessarily tied to your position of power, your willingness to change organizations. That might exacerbate it a little bit. That might magnify that tendency. But what we're finding is that people now believe organizations exist to serve them. Now, if you go back again to your father and your grandfather, did your grandfather believe that the company existed to serve him?
No.
Not a chance.
Not a chance.
That's
No.
not what your country can do for you.
But what you can do for your country. Great example. Great example. Now, do we still believe in serving our country? Do we still believe in being part of organizations? Do we like that messaging? It's the messaging that's the problem. We now believe organizations exist to serve us. The populace, the general public, has been turned on to the power of organizing. And they believe organizing should serve them. A second paradigm. Change comes from the group, not from a specific individual. So peers are more important than authority figures in getting change through. So have you ever had an employee who worked really hard to lobby everybody around them so that they could come as a group to tell you that something needed to be changed? And you were like, why don't you just bring it to me? I would have changed it. It's not a big deal. I'm open to this. Why don't you just come to me? Why'd you get everybody all riled up? Well, because society now, the trend is that peers are how you accomplish change. It doesn't mean they have a problem with you as the manager. They just didn't occur to them that you were empowered to make that change easier than mustering all the peers. Think about that in the workplace. It's not that you as a manager are unempowered. It's that they don't even think of you first anymore. You needed a problem solved. In the past, you went to the person in charge. You petitioned the government figure running it. You went to the manager who could change something. You went to mom and dad to change something in the family. The tendency to muster peers is a function of societal changes in organizing, not just a function of I can tweet you easier than I used to be able to. Right? And this is the one. Where'd you go? Yeah, go ahead.
I'm just curious, it just makes me think, because you see simultaneously kind of this other movement, which is regular people getting into positions of authority in politics, which in some ways seems to contradict that, because it sounds like you're saying that you don't recognize authority positions, you recognize peer positions, but you also have this other thing going on.
Well, it's really interesting because we leverage our peers to get something done because we don't believe the authority figure is relevant to getting it done. And the outcome of leveraging our peers is often that one of us becomes the authority figure in the peer group. Right. So what does that mean? I think in some ways it means that we can't really overthrow the notion of leadership, right? That leaderless, Occupy is known as a leaderless movement, except if you go and research Occupy, you will find that there's a man who calls himself the co-founder of the Occupy movement. Now, how is he the co-founder of a leaderless movement? That's interesting, right? And he claims to be the co-founder of a leaderless movement. And he wrote a book on it. And I'm like, I don't think leaderless means what you think it means, right? He became the leader. And it's true, he wrote one of the manifestos early on that kind of spurred the whole deal. And now he's making money as the leader of the leaderless movement. So yeah, I don't think it's contradictory. I think it's a natural emergence of what happens when groups get together is leaders officially authorized, or by position or by expert or by appearance, people become leaders. So this is not necessarily an anti-leader movement. It's a change is affected by crowds, not by single people, and not by people in charge or institutionally. Yeah.
I may have a different opinion.
Great.
I'm not trying to.
You can disagree.
Maybe coming from another country, what I noticed is that here in the States, people want people that they know where they're going. And if you want to be a leader, you just need to show that you know where you're going, and people will follow. And when we talk about leaderless organizations, I really don't believe there's a leaderless organization. They just follow people who know where they're going. Whether they proclaim themselves that they're leaders or not leaders, or there's no organization. And I think I've done well in my companies acting that way, not even knowing that I knew the most of that. You know what I'm saying?
I do.
Just
Yeah, what you're talking about is the thing that matters is my ability to persuade other people, not my job title or my official position in the organization or the amount of money I have, or you just said that anyone who can convince other people to let them lead is a leader.
Yeah.
Right? Think about that. Anyone who can convince is a leader. I mean, you always thought you had to be reasonably articulate and convincing, but you also knew at the end of the day you're in charge, right? He's saying that he's seen that you can be the leader simply by saying it in a powerful and persuasive way.
the reason why I'm saying is because people in my organization know way much more than I do. Seriously, if I had to.
And they're glad you recognize that.
And yeah, but we're better engineers, better architects, but I think I have an act to do something different.
Yeah.
And so you don't need to be the best of the best. You have to just know how to deal with people.
Well, being good at leading is a specialized expertise, different than being good at engineering or, good at some of these things these other people in your organization are good at. You also bring up a really good point, which is a lot of the research that's been done on this is not global research. It's U.S.-based research. So we're going to see some differences, and we don't know what those are yet, I don't think. I think it doesn't mean it doesn't apply, but I think it means it's really not as well thought out in a global context as it is in a U.S. context. Yeah, great point. So the joining an organization should increase my connections and knowledge, not constrain them. So when I join your company should connect me to the outside world, not keep me from connecting to the outside world. You should be sending me to that industry trade show. You should not mind that I'm in that Facebook group with 5 competitors. You should, this job should broaden my horizons. This organization should broaden my horizons. This religious group can't tell me what I should and shouldn't hear. They can direct my belief system and tell me what they think is a good thing for me to believe, and I can choose to affiliate with that, but not the restriction of access to people and information. This is kind of a big deal. Do you want to give your example?
Sure. So I was telling Heather during the break, one of my sons, so we're members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, one of my sons has disaffiliated himself, and his issue is that the church does not have transparent finances. That's his only issue. It's not doctrinal. There's no other concern, and I've really struggled to understand that, but in the context of what we've talked about this morning, it makes sense because he has so many options of groups that he can be part of that it's important to him to have transparency, and the church doesn't, so he doesn't want to be part of it. And I don't fully still understand it, but I can sense the root of what's going on in his mind.
It's kind of an organizational issue rather than a doctrinal issue.
Correct.
And from the perspective of a religious group not publishing the salaries of the top leaders, a lot of times we view that kind of thing as efficiency. right? They weren't viewing it as a lack of transparency. You don't think they set out to, like, let's have a lack of transparency. They were viewing it as a need to know. You know, this is relevant for the administration of this part of the church organization, and other people don't need to know. Well, need to know is kind of an outdated concept in the world of organizing, because anything anybody wants to know, they feel like they should be able to know. And this need to know concept is being challenged, which means there's a whole lot of time needing to be spent helping people process information, right? When the more information people have, the more time you spend with them helping them process it and figure out how they can work together effectively with this broader worldview. It's time you maybe didn't have to spend before. And in organizations, you know, special forces, where there really is a need to know, right? It's very institutional and central, and the need to know is bounded to the set of things you need to know. I don't know how that kind of institutional paradigm, which is even stronger than the corporate need to know paradigm, will play out in these changing trends.